My ranch was my sanctuary, until a new suburban HOA declared my ancient fence an eyesore. What they didn't know was that a forgotten legal document was about to turn their pristine community into my personal fiefdom. The smell of my ranch is the smell of my inheritance. It's a mix of old leather from my grandfather's tack room, damp earth after a morning rain, and the sweet, sharp scent of pine from the forest that borders my property. For 30 years, this 200-acre slice of heaven was my escape. For the last 2, it's been my home. I left a soul-crushing career as a property rights attorney in the city to come back to the one place where rules were dictated by the seasons, not by committees. I traded my briefcase for a post-hole digger, my $1,000 suits for worn-out Carhartts, and my penthouse view for an endless expanse of Texas sky. I thought I had found perfect, blissful peace. And I had, right up until they built Whispering Pines Estates. The development sprouted like a fungus on my eastern border. A beige, vinyl-sided blight of cookie-cutter houses, each with a perfectly manicured lawn that looked like it was cut with surgical scissors. With the new houses came new people, and with new people came the Homeowners Association. And with the HOA came Carol. Carol Blevins was the self-appointed queen of Whispering Pines, the president of the HOA, and the thorn in my otherwise peaceful existence. Our first interaction was about my fence. Not a new fence, mind you, but the same weathered cedar post and barbed wire fence that had marked my family's property line for over 70 years. It was sturdy, it was functional, and it kept my handful of cattle from wandering onto their pristine, chemically treated lawns. She'd marched right up to it one afternoon, her fists planted on her hips, a visor shielding her perpetually pinched face from the sun. "Excuse me," she'd called out, her voice carrying across the pasture like a screech owl. "I'm Carol Blevins, president of the Whispering Pines HOA. We're going to have to talk about this. Eyesore." I'd ambled over from the barn, wiping grease from my hands onto an old rag. "Ma'am, this fence is on my property. It's been here longer than your entire development. It's not going anywhere. It's a safety hazard," she'd shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the barbed wire. "And it violates at least a dozen of our aesthetic covenants. We require a 6-foot white vinyl privacy fence between all adjacent properties." I remember I just laughed. Not a mean laugh, just a genuine, bewildered chuckle. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your covenants mean about as much as a screen door on a submarine out here. My property is not, nor will it ever be, part of your HOA. This is the property line. You stay on your side, I'll stay on mine, and we'll get along just fine." She did not like that. Her face turned a shade of crimson I'd only ever seen on a rooster's wattle. She started spouting off about property values, legal action, and how I was a blight on her idyllic community. I just tipped my hat, turned around, and went back to fixing my tractor. That was mistake number 1. I thought ignoring her would make her go away. I had severely underestimated the boundless, terrifying energy of a bored suburbanite with a taste for power. Over the next few months, the complaints trickled in through official channels. A letter from the HOA's lawyer, a 20-something kid I could have professionally eviscerated in my sleep, about my unpermitted agricultural structures, which was my granddad's old historic barn. A notice about excessive noise, when I was using my chainsaw to clear a fallen oak tree at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. A complaint about unpleasant odors, which is what city folk call the smell of honest-to-God nature. I ignored them all. I was on my land, following every county and state law to the letter. Her little kingdom's rules stopped dead at my 70-year-old fence. The breaking point came last Saturday. A summer storm had knocked down a section of that very fence Carol so despised. It was my top priority. I couldn't risk my cattle getting out. I was out there at sunrise digging new post holes, stretching new wire, sweat dripping from my brow. It was hard, honest work. The sun was beating down, the cicadas were buzzing, and for a few hours the world felt right again. I was so focused, I didn't even notice her watching me from her back patio, a phone pressed to her ear. I was wrestling a heavy cedar post into place when I saw the flash of red and blue lights against the trees. 2 county sheriff's deputies were pulling their cruisers up my long gravel driveway. They got out slowly, their hands resting near their hips, their expressions grim. I dropped the post driver and put my hands up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. What in the world was going on? One of the deputies, a young guy with a nervous look on his face, kept his eyes on me. The older one, a sergeant with a weathered face and tired eyes, walked towards the fence line where Carol was now standing, pointing dramatically in my direction. "He's the one, officer," she yelled, her voice trembling with fake fear. "He's been out here for hours, building some kind of hostile barrier and threatening me." The sergeant looked from her to my half-mended fence, to the tools lying on the ground, and then back to me. He sighed, the kind of sigh a man makes when he knows his day is about to be ruined by paperwork. He walked over to me, staying a respectful distance away. "Sir, we received a 911 call from that lady over there," he said, nodding towards Carol. "She's claiming you're brandishing a weapon and making terroristic threats." He gestured to the 10-pound steel post driver lying in the grass next to me. "She seems to believe that's a weapon." I stared at him, then at Carol, who was now puffing her chest out, looking triumphant. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it all was breathtaking. She called 911. She claimed I was a terrorist for fixing my own fence on my own land. The fury that had been simmering for months began to boil over, but it was quickly replaced by an ice-cold clarity. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. This was war. She had crossed a line that she couldn't even see. The sergeant looked at me, waiting for an explanation. I took a deep, steadying breath, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. I looked past the deputy, locking eyes with Carol. I wanted her to see the exact moment her perfect little world started to crumble. "Officer," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Her name is Carol Blevins, 32 Whispering Pines Lane. I highly advise you get her full, detailed statement on your body cam. Make sure she repeats the part about terroristic threats. Because when her house and every other house in that development has a permanent, unremovable, toxic waste easement filed against its deed, I want a perfect, high-definition record of the exact moment she gave me the legal justification to do it." The young deputy blinked, his mouth slightly agape. The sergeant's expression, however, shifted from weary resignation to sharp, calculated interest. He looked me up and down, as if seeing me for the first time, not just some guy in a dusty hat, but someone who spoke a language he understood, even if he didn't like it. Carol, on the other hand, went completely rigid, her face contorted with a mixture of confusion and rage. "What? Toxic waste. He's threatening me again, officer. He's a lunatic," she shrieked, her voice cracking. I kept my gaze locked on the sergeant. "Officer, that woman," I said, nodding calmly in her direction, "has engaged in a documented pattern of harassment against me for the better part of a year. Today she escalated by filing a false police report, a malicious and frivolous use of emergency services, claiming I was a terrorist for mending a fence. That is a tortious act. She has interfered with my right to the quiet enjoyment of my property. As president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, she is acting as their agent, which means when I file my civil suit for damages, and believe me, I'll be naming her and the entire HOA as defendants. Your bodycam footage of her unsubstantiated and hysterical claims will make a wonderful Exhibit A in my motion for summary judgment." The legal jargon hung in the air like thick smoke. The younger deputy looked utterly lost, but the sergeant's eyes narrowed. He understood perfectly. I wasn't making a threat. I was laying out a blueprint. He turned his back on me and walked deliberately toward Carol. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and firm, "is this man currently on your property?" "Well, no, but his fence—" "Ma'am, is he on your property? Yes or no?" "No." "Did he verbally threaten you before you called 911? His demeanor was very aggressive. And that metal thing? Ma'am, did he threaten you? Yes or no?" A sputtering silence was her only answer. The sergeant let it hang there for a long moment before continuing. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious offense. Misusing the 911 system is a serious offense. This is a civil dispute over a fence. You have wasted the county's time and resources today. If we get another call out here that doesn't involve a legitimate, life-threatening emergency, I will personally ensure you are cited. Do you understand me?" Carol's face went pale. The triumphant queen had been dethroned in front of an audience. She gave me one last look, a glare so filled with venom it could have curdled milk, then spun on her heel and stormed back to her perfectly beige house. The sergeant walked back over to me. He gave a curt nod. "Try to keep it civil, sir." "I'm always civil, Sergeant. I just have a very low tolerance for bullies." He almost smiled. "Have a good day." With that, he and his partner got back in their cruisers and drove away, leaving me alone in a cloud of dust and silence. The adrenaline wore off, and a profound exhaustion took its place. I looked at the half-mended fence, the post driver lying in the grass. The victory felt hollow. I had won the battle, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that the war was just beginning. Carol wasn't the type to retreat. She would regroup, find a new line of attack, and come at me with twice the fury. Harassment, frivolous lawsuits, code compliance complaints. She would try to bury me in 1,000 paper cuts. Ignoring her was no longer an option. I had to end this, not just for my peace of mind, but for the legacy my grandfather left me. I walked back to the old ranch house, the floorboards groaning a familiar welcome. I bypassed the kitchen and went straight to his study, a room I'd left almost exactly as it was the day he passed. It still smelled of old paper and cherry pipe tobacco. He was a rancher through and through, but he was also one of the shrewdest men I'd ever known. He'd fought off 3 different developers in his time, all of them trying to carve up this land. He used to tell me, "The best fence isn't made of wood or wire, son. It's made of paper, filed in triplicate down at the county courthouse." I went to the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner. The bottom drawer was labeled Land, E-Parcel Sale, 1988. That was the section he finally sold off, the land that eventually became Whispering Pines. He was land-rich but cash-poor back then, and selling that parcel was the only way to save the rest of the ranch from the bank. But he never trusted the developer he sold it to, a slick guy from Dallas named Miller. My grandfather wasn't a man who left things to chance. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled out the thick, bulging folder. It was filled with title abstracts, survey maps, and correspondence. I sifted through the dry, crackling papers, my legal training kicking back in, scanning for keywords and clauses. And then I found it. Tucked into the back, separate from the main sales contract, was a thin, blue-bound document. It looked different from the rest, older, more formal. The title on the cover was typed in an old serif font, Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions for the Miller Land Grant. My heart started to pound. This was it. This was the poison pill he'd told me about once. The developer Miller was in such a hurry to close the deal that his attorneys must have missed it or dismissed it as some old, unenforceable rancher's nonsense. I flipped through the dense legalese, pages of boilerplate about mineral rights and water access, until I reached the final page, Article X, Governing Authority. My breath caught in my throat. My grandfather, the crafty old son of a gun, had done it. The clause was beautifully, brutally simple. It stated that as long as the original contiguous property, my ranch, remained a functioning, tax-assessed, agricultural operation, it retained a permanent, non-transferable position as an architectural review overcommittee, with absolute veto power over any future homeowners association's bylaws, aesthetic covenants, and enforcement actions. I read it again, and then a third time, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across my face. The toxic waste easement was a bluff. This was real. This was a legal nuke. Carol and her Whispering Pines HOA didn't just answer to their own board, they answered to me. I didn't have to dissolve her HOA. According to this legally binding document, filed with the county 30 years ago, I was effectively its king. The old paper felt like a royal scepter in my hand. King. I was the king of Whispering Pines Estates. I could veto their beige siding, their perfectly manicured lawns, their militant obsession with hidden trash cans. I could, with the stroke of a pen, invalidate every single fine Carol had ever levied. The power was dizzying, absolute, and frankly, hilarious. My grandfather wasn't just a rancher. He was a legal artist, and this covenant was his masterpiece. But power is only useful if it's wielded correctly. My first instinct was to march over to Carol's house, wave the document in her pinched face, and declare myself her new overlord. But my years as a lawyer screamed against it. This wasn't a time for emotion. It was a time for strategy. A declaration of war needs a proper opening salvo, one that's impossible to ignore and perfectly unimpeachably legal. I spent the rest of the weekend in that dusty office, surrounded by my grandfather's books. I cross-referenced the covenant with county records, ensuring no amendments had ever been filed. I checked state property law precedents to confirm its ironclad enforceability. It was perfect. The original developer, Miller, had sold the land to another corporation, who then built Whispering Pines. The covenant, being tied to the land itself, had transferred seamlessly through both sales. The current HOA was legally bound by it, whether they knew it or not, and it was painfully obvious they did not. My plan began to form. It wouldn't be a frontal assault. It would be a slow, creeping siege. I wouldn't just defeat Carol. I would make her own rules, her own precious system, dismantle her reign of terror piece by piece. The first step was information. I needed a copy of the current Whispering Pines HOA bylaws. Normally these are a matter of public record, but I didn't want to tip my hand by requesting them from the county. I needed an inside source, and I knew just the person. His name was Bob. He was a retired accountant who lived 3 doors down from Carol. We'd struck up a few conversations over the fence line before Carol had unofficially forbidden fraternization with the enemy. Bob was a kind, quiet man who was in a constant state of low-grade terror over the length of his grass. A few months back, I'd helped him pull his old John Deere mower out of a ditch, and he'd been grateful ever since. I found him Monday morning, meticulously trimming his hedges with a pair of tiny shears. "Morning, Bob," I called out. He jumped, nearly snipping off a prize-winning rose. "Oh, good morning," he said, his eyes darting nervously towards Carol's house. "Lovely day." "It is," I said, leaning casually against my fence. "Say, Bob, I have a bit of a strange request. I'm thinking of putting up a new barn, and I want to make sure the color of the roof paint won't cause a fuss with your association. I was wondering if you might have a copy of the HOA bylaws I could look at. Just the section on aesthetic requirements would be fine." Bob's eyes widened. "Oh, I don't know. Carol is very particular about who sees the governing documents, as she calls them. She keeps the only official binder." "I understand," I said, my voice smooth as butter. "But you're on the board, aren't you? The treasurer?" "I already knew this from my research." "You must have a copy for your own records." He looked conflicted. "Well, yes, she emailed us all a PDF last year." "That would be perfect," I smiled. "You'd be doing me a huge favor, just trying to be a good neighbor." The phrase, good neighbor, was the key. It was the currency of the suburbs. Bob's desire to be a good neighbor warred with his fear of Carol. Thankfully, decency won out. "All right," he whispered. "But you didn't get it from me. I'll email it to you this afternoon." By 2 o'clock, the 87-page PDF was in my inbox. It was a masterpiece of petty tyranny. Rules about the exact shade of white for window trim, the maximum number of days a holiday decoration could be displayed, the approved species of mailbox-adjacent shrubbery. It was more restrictive than a federal prison. I spent the next hour reading it, cover to cover, a highlighter in my hand. Then I began to draft my first official decree as the Architectural Review Overcommittee. I typed it up on my old law firm's letterhead, which I kept for just such special occasions. It was formal, professional, and dripping with legal authority. It began, "Pursuant to the authority granted in the legally filed and recorded Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions for the Miller Land Grant, Article X, the Architectural Review Overcommittee hereby issues the following binding resolution, effective immediately." The resolution contained 2 points. First, all enforcement actions, including the issuance of fines and liens related to aesthetic covenant violations as described in Whispering Pines HOA bylaws, Article 4, Sections 2 to 14, are hereby suspended indefinitely pending a full review by the Overcommittee. This effectively neutered Carol's main weapon. Second, and this was the beautiful part. Furthermore, the Overcommittee, exercising its authority to establish and approve aesthetic standards, hereby declares that natural native landscaping, including prairie grasses, wildflowers, and xeriscaping, are not only permitted, but are the preferred aesthetic for the Whispering Pines Estates community. The mandated use of monoculture turf grasses, requiring excessive watering and chemical treatment, is hereby discouraged. I was turning their own weapon against them. I was using their obsession with aesthetic rules to legalize a form of landscaping that was the polar opposite of their sterile ideal. I was giving every resident who was sick of mowing their lawn a get-out-of-jail-free card. I printed 10 copies. One would be sent via certified mail to the HOA's official mailing address, a P.O. box I knew Carol checked daily. The other 9 would be for my new disciples. I drove into town and made a quick stop at the feed store for a bag of wildflower seeds, a hardy, fast-growing Texas mix. The next morning, under the cover of a pre-dawn haze, I walked the perimeter of my property along the Whispering Pines border. I visited Bob's house first, leaving a copy of the decree and a small bag of seeds on his porch. I did the same for a few other houses where I'd seen residents look weary and downtrodden, the ones who always seemed to have a violation notice taped to their door. My final stop was the community notice board near the development's entrance. I took down a flyer for a lost cat, and using 4 sturdy thumbtacks pinned my official resolution directly in its place, right under the glass. Then I went home, sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, and waited for the sun to come up on Whispering Pines. I didn't have to wait long. The first sign of chaos was a car door slamming, followed by the unmistakable sound of Carol's screeching voice. I watched through my binoculars as she stood in front of the notice board, her body vibrating with rage. She ripped my notice from the board, tore it into tiny pieces, and threw it to the ground like confetti. But it was too late. The first seeds of rebellion had already been sown. Carol tearing down my notice was a declaration of war I had fully anticipated. It was also, legally speaking, a fatal mistake. Destroying an official notice posted pursuant to a governing land covenant. That was another beautiful little tort I could add to my growing list. But I knew the real battle wouldn't be fought on a community notice board. It would be fought in the hearts and minds of the beige house dwellers. The certified letter arrived at her P.O. box the next day. I can only imagine the apoplectic fit she must have thrown at the post office. The fallout was immediate. That evening, I received a frantic email from Bob. The subject line was just urgent. He told me Carol had called an emergency HOA meeting. Attendance was mandatory. The sole agenda item was the hostile and fraudulent document distributed by the belligerent adjacent landowner. I chuckled as I read it. Belligerent. I was rather fond of that. The next day, as I was oiling a saddle in the barn, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up my driveway. A man in a suit so expensive it looked like it was woven from $100 bills stepped out. He introduced himself as Arthur Vance, the senior partner at the law firm representing the Whispering Pines HOA. "Mr. Vance," I said, not bothering to get up or wipe the grease from my hands, "to what do I owe the pleasure? Come to admire my 70-year-old fence?" He did not smile. "My client, the Whispering Pines HOA, has received a rather imaginative piece of correspondence from you. They have retained me to inform you that you are to cease and desist all communication and retract your baseless claims of authority, or we will be forced to pursue immediate legal action for harassment and filing a fraudulent instrument." I finally stood up, wiping my hands on my rag. I looked him dead in the eye. "Arthur, before you embarrass yourself and commit your client to a lawsuit that will get you sanctioned for frivolous litigation, I suggest you do 2 things. First, go to the county records office and pull the original deed and covenant declarations for parcel ID 77B4. And second, read the 1992 State Appellate Court decision in Turner v. Brazos River Authority. It sets a very clear precedent for the enforceability of senior land covenants like mine. You do that, and then you can come back and we can discuss the terms of your client's unconditional surrender." He stared at me, his lawyer brain processing the specific, actionable information I'd just given him. The confident smirk wavered. I hadn't just made a vague threat. I'd cited case law. He cleared his throat. "I will take that under advisement." He got back in his Mercedes and drove away, much faster than he had arrived. The emergency HOA meeting was that night. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. My spies were on the inside. Around 9 o'clock, my phone started buzzing. It was Bob. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice a giddy whisper. "It's a madhouse. Carol started the meeting by calling you a terrorist and a fraud. She said her lawyer was going to sue you into oblivion. She was trying to get everyone to vote on a special assessment fee to fund the lawsuit against you." "And?" I prompted. And then Mrs. Gable from down the street stood up. Her husband is a retired real estate attorney. She said Carol was being an idiot. I could hear muffled shouting in the background. She said she'd looked up the covenant you cited, and it was 100% legitimate. Then a few other people who got your notice, and the wildflower seeds started chiming in. They said they were tired of the fines, tired of being told what color to paint their own front doors. People started yelling that they were going to plant wildflowers, that they were going to put up a basketball hoop, that they were going to park their perfectly legal pickup truck in their own driveway. The beautiful, glorious sound of suburban anarchy. It was music to my ears. Bob continued, breathless. Carol lost it. She started screaming that they were all in violation, that she was going to fine them all. Then Mr. Gable stood up and read from your notice, the part about all fine enforcement being suspended. He said if Carol tried to issue a single fine, she'd be in contempt of a legally binding covenant and could be held personally liable for damages. The room just exploded. The coup de grace came a week later. I received another letter from Arthur Vance. The tone was considerably different. It was an invitation to a special mediation session with the HOA board. They were ready to talk. I showed up at their community clubhouse, not in my dusty Carhartts, but in one of my old $1,000 suits. I wanted them to remember exactly who they were dealing with. The entire board was there, including a very pale and silent Carol. Arthur Vance facilitated. "My clients," he began, "are prepared to formally acknowledge the unique nature of the Miller Land Grant Covenant." "Good," I said. "That's a start. Now let's talk about the future." Over the next 2 hours, we hammered out a new set of rules. I didn't want to be a tyrant like Carol. I just wanted peace. I used my veto power to strike down 2/3 of their ridiculous aesthetic rules. I formalized the allowance for native plants and xeriscaping. We established a clear, simple set of guidelines for property maintenance that focused on safety and cleanliness, not on enforcing a Stepford wife level of conformity. My only other demand was a formal written apology from the HOA, signed by Carol, for the malicious 911 call. Carol looked like she'd swallowed a wasp, but with the entire board and her own lawyer staring her down, she had no choice. She signed. In the end, I didn't have to dissolve her HOA. I had done something far better. I had declawed it. I had transformed it from a weapon of petty oppression into what it was always supposed to be, a simple administrative body for managing the community pool. Carol Blevins was still the president, but her title was now utterly meaningless. Her power was gone. The best part? Last weekend I saw Bob outside, not with his tiny shears, but with a rototiller, tearing up a huge patch of his perfect green lawn. He waved me over. "What do you think?" he said, gesturing to the freshly turned earth. "I'm putting in a whole meadow of those Texas wildflowers you gave me. My wife is thrilled." I looked past his yard, down the once identical street of Whispering Pines Estates. Here and there I could see other splashes of color, other patches of defiance, a bright yellow front door, a decorative fence made of reclaimed wood, a small vegetable garden where a prize-winning rosebush used to be. It wasn't a beige monolith anymore. It was starting to look like a neighborhood, a place where actual people lived. I leaned against my 70-year-old fence, the one that started it all, and took in the view. The smell of old leather and pine from my side, and the faint, sweet scent of newly planted wildflowers from theirs. My grandfather had been right. The best fences are made of paper, and the peace they create is the most satisfying inheritance of all.